Chapter 11 of The Wind by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2021. Chapter 11. June passed into July, July into August, and still the drought continued. "Hot as a six-shooter," Sourdough said. The sand was like hot ashes heated from the furnace that was the sky and the furnace that was the earth, while the wind was an oven blast and the days were live coals dragged over the land. Old Pedro had a weather prophecy for every incident, every detail he observed, and he came often to see Letty and express himself as to what was in store for them. When they heard, or imagined they did, the sound of locusts droning, he shook his grey head dolefully. "When the locusts cantar, that mean more drought." When the whirlwinds passed across the plain, moving spirals of sand silent and swift, he looked depressed. "That mean no rain for yet," he muttered. A foggy morning was to him a bad sign, though Letty argued with specious optimism that fog should rightly hint of rain. "You no know this land, señorita, this terra caliente," he said. When rattlesnakes came out in numbers, Sourdough muttered, "That don't look good. They're moving toward water and away from a dry country." He killed a big rattler with 11 rattles and a button, as he boasted, and hung it over the fence to the starve-out to bring rain. "That ought to fetch rain," he remarked hopefully. Lige regarded it with gloomy eye. "I bet they's a rattler on mighty nigh every fence post in this section o' country. Every optimistic cuss like you is tryin' out the sign. But 'tain't no use, for all signs fail in a drought." "It will rain when God wills," said old Pedro piously, as he lifted his gnarled hands toward the sky, and then crossed himself. "But if you turn the snake on its back so the under part shows, it's said to bring rain," contended Sourdough. "Try it, son, try it," mocked Lige. "You might get your toy popgun out and practice shootin' rattlers," Sourdough said to Letty. "No, thank you," was her listless reply. "I don't know which I'd be worse afraid of to try to handle, a rattlesnake or a loaded gun." "Well, you want to be careful of the business end of both," he chuckled. She scarcely heard him, for her spirit was in another country. In August, in Virginia, the lanes and meadows would be filled with flowers. The daisy fields would have faded now, but there would be Bouncing Bet, saucy and vagrant by the roadside, and stretches of blue chicory, like cornflowers, gay as a flock of indigo buntings that had lighted on swaying stems. Queen Anne's lace would be like cobweb in fairy designs held upward for the passing gaze. Wild morning glories would be climbing up every cornstalk in the fields, purple and blue and white, lifting their fragile frills away from the dew and the touch of the soil. The wild roses that had bloomed everywhere in June would have passed, for the most part, now, but a few would remain, white and fragrant and ephemeral as a young girl's dream of love, before love has come to her. Ah, what if one were still young, still a girl in years, but snatched away from wild roses and from girlhood dreams to perish of homesickness in a desert. The jewel weed would be dangling its lovely shining pendants in the sun, golden filigree fit for fairies to wear. The butterfly weed would flaunt its bright orange blossoms by the roadside, a lure for the multicolored, winged things of summer. Up the dead stumps, the fence posts, clambering to tree tops, would be the trumpet vine with its scarlet bugles. In the woods there would be wild lilies like Indian maidens, tall and rich-colored, while by the edges of streams the ferns would grow, soft and green. Oh, the little brooks that chuckled to themselves as they strayed through the woods and the meadows. If only she might dip her fingers in their waters and cool her burning forehead. She could close her eyes and see the still woods, where the pines stood on tiptoe to peer into heaven, but did they see anything there more beautiful than themselves? Where the oaks and the poplars and many another tree showed infinitude of restful greens and purplish shadows, the sunlight like sifted gold making a patina in the grass. Grey-green trunks with lichens on them and little lizards darting up and down like idle thoughts. Benignant spread of branches where birds sang, where squirrels frisked and chattered, and little tree-toads croaked about rain. She looked out over a desert plain. Her eyes ached from the hot sand that the wind blew in them, and from the glare of the sun on parched prairies where no trees shaded the earth. The wind was not so boisterous now as it had been in the winter and early spring, but it blew steadily, relentlessly, till her nerves felt she could bear no more. Never a breath of coolness, never any soothing moisture in the breeze, but a hot, dry blast that seemed to bake her brain, that drove burning sand against her burning cheeks. She could see the heat waves eddy up from the ground and shimmer upward in the sun, visible signs of the torment the people endured. She watched the whirlwinds race across the plain, and remembered that they were prophecies of longer drought. She would look yearningly at the sky for hope of a cooling shower, but she saw only the heavens' awful blue, as clear, as bright as glass, with no clouds anywhere. The buzzards soared clumsily overhead. Sometimes again there would be clouds, a pageantry of colour at sunset and sunrise, a wild richness of sky that seemed like the conflagration of a world. Then she remembered that Sourdough had said those brilliant cloud effects came with drought, and she turned with a shudder away from their beauty. The only beauty that nature showed her here was a menace. The wind blew the sand everywhere as high as she could see, so that it hung a golden gauze between her and the sun, shot through with light. She watched the coppery sun stride across the blue, day after day, and thought of Lige's saying that a coppery sky in time of drought meant more dry weather. She saw few signs of life now. A horned toad would sometimes flash by her, its bright beady eyes glittering, its spiked body covered with horny protuberances like a coat of mail, or an ashen lizard would slip past. Sourdough told her one day, "Horned frogs can squirt blood out of their eyes at you if you skeer 'em, folks says." After that she was more afraid of them than of rattlesnakes. Sourdough tried to be jocose about the situation. "Well, at least we ain't having no cyclones," he said to Letty one day. "Folks out here say, 'Never mind the weather so the wind don't blow.'" The plains in their terrible distinctness showed dead prairie dogs, dead jackrabbits here and there. They had perished for lack of food and water. Only the coyotes remained, and they prowled night and day, for they lived on flesh, and grew fat on the bodies of the dead. There were no songbirds left, only the buzzards, carrion birds. Only the buzzards and coyotes were well fed. The great hideous birds were too gorged to fly high now, and flapped their wings lazily over the ground, above where the dead horses and cattle lay in stark attitudes. The desert mocked her with its mirages, showing her, across a stretch of yellow-grey sand with its clumps of bear grass and leafless mesquite bushes, the vision of green trees and still lakes with willows dipping down to them. Sunrise and sunset on the prairies were incredibly beautiful, as if a world about to be annihilated flamed up in awful, unforgettable glory as a last spectacle for the eyes of man. But sunrise and sunset were associated with the thought of Wirt Roddy now, and so she told herself she mustn't look at them nor think of them. She must forget. She mustn't remember that she had ever thought of him. She became nervous and jumpy, starting to hear the wind rattle the ragged dried leaves of the yucca, peering to see the uncanny shapes that dusk made to flit across the plains. She felt that if once she lost control of her nerves, they would break beyond hope of recovery, so she kept a tense restraint on herself, a restraint that was more wearing than outbursts of emotion would have been. A shrewish fit of temper, or a hysterical spell of crying would have relaxed her, would have done her good, but she did not know that. She was afraid to let go. At times she was acutely aware of all that went on about her, as if her consciousness were purely physical, a response to sense impressions, the sting of the sand, the hot breath of the wind, the acrid smell of dust, the rasping roughness of everything she touched, the taste of the unpalatable food in her mouth, the drone of the wind, the lowing of cattle, the sight of the barren desert. At such times she felt she had no mind, no soul, but was merely a bundle of senses that rendered a message of pain for each impression they received of their world. At other times she felt she was not there in the body at all, was unaware of anything physical, but conscious only of the psychical, of her loneliness, her longings, her despairs. She felt lifted beyond the physical into a realm of spirit that felt keener suffering, as if her body had been stripped from her to leave her soul naked to pain. At other times she felt a twofold suffering of sense and soul. She began dimly to comprehend how women tried beyond endurance might sometimes go mad. Now and then, as if deliberately torturing herself, she forced herself to face each crude, repellent detail of her environment, to let the worst of it sink into her deepest consciousness. The rough walls, on which the torn strips of newspaper were hanging, rent by the wind, the lumpy, sagging bed that no attention could make even, the chairs with rawhide seats, the table littered with pipes and tobacco pouches, the old hats and clothes hanging on the wall because there was no closet, the kerosene lamp that always seemed to smoke, despite what she could do, the sand and dust everywhere, all sickened her. She couldn't keep the rooms tidy because there was no place to put things away out of sight, no closets, no chests of drawers, no wardrobes. Her soul longed for neatness and order, but she was helpless to achieve it. In her other life, all that had been arranged for her without her thought. Lige and Sourdough were preoccupied with the progress of their own financial tragedy. They had thrashed out in talk between them all possible plans for saving their cattle, but they could settle on no feasible means. They had no money to buy feed, even if any were to be had near them. They had no wagons to haul it the long distances from the railroads, and no horses with strength enough to pull the loads. "They say some folks have gone to East Texas to put the case before the folks there, and see if some help can't be sent out here," said Sourdough one day after a parley that ended in no conclusion of relief. "They can send food for the folks that need it, but it'll be a hard job to get feedstuff for the critters, out this far, and off the railroads and all," said Lige dully. "And even if we had feed for 'em, how would we get water here?" went on Sourdough. "It'd be too much to tackle to haul water all that way for stock. All we can make out to do is to haul out drinking water for ourselves." "Yeah, we've done everything we can think of to get water," said Lige. True, they had scraped the bottoms of the old water holes in hope of finding moisture farther down. They had dug out places in creek beds so that perhaps springs once there might furnish drink, but each effort was only a mockery. There was no water. "You see, honey, we couldn't save 'em even if we could haul feedstuffs to 'em," said Lige one day. "The water holes is all dried up." "What is everybody else doing?" she gasped. "Well, the big ranchers have got deeper water holes than ourn. They can dig down and maybe get up a little water that way. Them that are closer to the railroad can haul water from there that the roads bring in. Some of 'em shipped most of their cattle on the railroad before the drought got so bad. That has knocked the bottom out of prices too, so you couldn't get nothing for 'em anyway. It's a god-awful time." "It makes a feller plumb sick to see the dumb critters suffer like this, when there ain't nothin' we can do for 'em," said Lige one day. "Yeah," agreed Sourdough. "It's enough to make you gag till you throw up your toenails. And this heat's enough to make your brain clabber." Letty was sick with sympathy for the suffering that she saw all about her. Gaunt, cadaverous beasts staggered about, tortured by heel flies that nagged them constantly, bawling in distress, searching everywhere for food and water. They had devoured every spear of the dried bunch grass and needle grass, every leaf and bean from the mesquite bushes, every stalk of last year's weeds, and now there was nothing, nothing. They came close to the house as if making appeal to their masters not to abandon them to death. Lige's face would twist as he turned away from the sight of them. Letty's eyes were dim with tears of pity she constantly shed for them. The lump in her throat and the weight about her heart never left her. "Oh, Lige, isn't there something you could do for them?" she burst out one day. He turned his palms upward in a gesture of helplessness. "What can I do? I've got no money to pay for feed and water, no horses to haul it, no wagons to bring it, no credit to borrow on, if I could make out to get it here." His voice was leaden, his face grey, his eyes bloodshot. She twisted her apron in her hands and gave a shuddering sob like a hurt child. "It looks to me like I just can't stand to see these poor things tortured so." He moved restlessly. "I know. It ain't so easy for me neither. But I'm at my rope's end." "And they've just got to starve to death with us looking at them." Her voice rose shrilly. His mouth set grimly. "I reckon we'll have to turn our eyes the other way then." She strangled a sob in her throat and covered her face with her hands. She had never watched anything die. Her mother had slipped away in her sleep, so there had been no fear nor horror in her going. But to watch these helpless animals die before her eyes in slow tortures of hunger and thirst, how could she bear it? But she had to bear it. Unless she bandaged her eyes and stuffed her ears with cotton, she could not escape their torment. She had to see them as they milled around restlessly, tossing their heads, their long horns glittering in the sun. They pawed the ground as if to find food deep buried there, some greenness under the tricky sand, some water beneath the burning desert. She had to hear, day and night, their distressful bawling. Faint with hunger and thirst, they weakened themselves still further with their bellowing. Some of them threw their heads around to the side, as if the torture of thirst twisted the muscles. Their tongues swelled, turned black, protruded from their mouths. She had to see the cattle as they gathered round the dried-up water-hole close to the house to die, while the buzzards waited for them to fall, one by one. The loathsome birds perched on their shoulders and pecked out the eyes of the still living creatures. Their mournful lowing was not so loud now, but more like long drawn-out sobbing, human, very pitiful. Some of them went mad from thirst and fought, goring each other to death. One day Letty stood tense and shivering, her hands held over her ears to shut out the sounds. Lige touched her shoulders gently. "Pobrecita," he said. "Poor little thing." She caught her breath jerkily. "I saw dead cattle by the railroad track as I came out here." Her eyes showed horror at the remembrance. "Wirt Roddy said it was the trail to the west. I thought I couldn't stand it then, but they were dead, their torment was over." He thrust his hands deep into his pockets and turned his tragic eyes upon her. "You made a bad move when you came out to the west, didn't you? Pobrecita." She laughed hysterically. "The pastor fixed it up for me. He thought it would be the best thing I could do. He said he had prayed over it." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Wind by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in September 2021. Chapter 12. All hope that Lige and Sourdough had of saving the cattle was gone. The last of the starved longhorns had perished of hunger and thirst, and still the gods were not appeased. The heavens were heated brass, across which clouds drifted now and then, thin wisps of cotton down, or a trailing line like that of a seagull's wing, or a huddled mass like a flock of sheep. But they did not stay. Sometimes dark clouds banked themselves against the horizon and spread rapidly over the sky, while serpent tongues of flame flashed, and thunder muttered hope of rain, while anxious eyes scanned the heavens and suffocating hope beat at the heart. But only a few drops would fall, and then the sun would shine as naked and as brilliant as before. The clouds would vanish as quickly as they had come, and the watchers would turn away in despair. The steady south winds blew, a bad sign in a drought, the rangemen said, and the sand seeped in at every crevice of the house, and it was patterned quaintly by the wind freaks on the level plain. "It will rain when the good God wills," said old Pedro over and over. September came, and the people of the plains began to hope again, faintly and fearfully, lest a thing so presumptuous as hope might offend suspicious powers watching them. September might bring rain. But early September blows from the south began, and the old settlers shook their heads. "A bad sign," they said. "The drought won't break yet a while." And it did not. The section was almost depopulated by now, for all the heartsick people that could leave had done so. Covered wagons had toiled across the plains, grotesque and tragic as seen in the clear atmosphere that revealed everything, the horses ploughing through the deep sand, the flap of the curtains showing poverty-stricken household goods piled awkwardly inside. "You can see an old bedstead and a passel of kids hanging out of every one," said Lige one day. Letty watched the covered wagon with longing eyes. "Oh, Lige, can't we go too?" she said. He shook his head stolidly, though he moved restlessly in his chair. We got no money to go on, and nowheres to go to. Things are bound to take a turn for the better soon. If we can hang on and rattle with the old place till it rains, we can make it all right yet. I don't know, she quavered. You just wait and see, he muttered, with dull defiance in the face of fate. Elijah's tall frame was thinner than it used to be, his face leaner, with haggard lines, and his eyes burned in their sockets. He was nervous, where always before he had been calm and controlled. At nights he would often mutter in his sleep, and sometimes would start up with an exclamation or a shout, then sink back to his pillow again with a shuddering heave of his big body. Letty felt frightened as she watched him. To think of his succumbing to emotion was like seeing a mountain shaken by some internal convulsion, was like watching a granite cliff writhe in pain. His strength had been as calm, as sure as that of the stars. Physical suffering alone would never move him, she felt certain. He would have gone to the stake, have died of torture without uttering a groan, would have received a sheaf of arrows in his breast with no outcry. But his mental torment and suspense were proving almost too much for him, almost more than he could bear. Was it partly or largely because of her? Letty asked herself. Was it because he felt he had involved her in his fate, when but for him she might have managed some escape for herself from the toils in which she had been caught? What was he thinking of in the long hours when he sat in silence and looked at the prairie? Her heart melted with pity for him as she watched his sufferings, his suspense, rendered all the more poignant because of his stoic silence and restraint. Then it would harden rebelliously as she turned her gaze on herself. Couldn't a man find some way of saving his wife from such torment? "But I can't go away and leave my outfit," he explained to her morosely, time after time. "This is all the start I got, all I ever been able to get in the world. If I pick up and leave it, I'm busted flat, and I won't have the heart to begin again." "But you're busted if you stay," she importuned. "It's bound to rain again one of these days," he rejoined stubbornly. "And the fellers that had stuck by the land are going to have the best chanked." If only she had a family to give him a boost now. If only she had a home for them to go back to for a time. But she felt cut off from the world. "It's like being let down by a rope into a deep well and having the rope cut," she brooded. She, who at home had been the sunniest of creatures, was moody, with alternations of emotion that frightened her when she stopped to think of them. At times she would be irritable, would give short answers to Lige, would feel that she must scream if anyone spoke to her or looked at her. Then again she would be plunged into despondency so profound that it seemed she could never climb up to spiritual peace and light any more, as if she were hopelessly sunk in a pit of darkness. Such a period of gloom might be followed by one of unreasonable exhilaration. She would tell herself, after the fashion of the old king she remembered from the Old Testament, "Surely the bitterness of death is past. Surely good was coming to her round the corner of the next day or hour." Her spirit would walk on rainbow clouds, her whole body would tingle with inexplicable joy. She would put a ribbon in her hair and smile at Lige, whose patient eyes would light with relief to see her cheerful. But soon this exaltation would be followed by depression, by a lassitude of body and soul, so that she felt nothing, was a blank, swept clean of emotions as of sensations. They hoarded their precious drinking water, which had to be hauled in barrels from the railroad. They had to share it with Lige's horse, and thus must be as niggardly as possible in their own use of it. So now it was impossible to keep clean, and Letty's daintiness revolted at the sordid grime in which she had to live. As she washed her dishes and cooking vessels with a minimum of water, she visioned to herself the clear, cold little streams in Virginia, the full sweep of the yellow James River, the inexhaustible ocean that pounded against the sand at Virginia Beach. The thought of water became almost an insanity with her. In her troubled dreams at night, she was lost in a desert, struggling in the deep sand, her hands and face torn by mesquite thorns and cactus, her feet full of the needles of prickly pear, yet ever driven onward in her search for a water-hole, deep water into which she might plunge and be cool and clean once more, water that should wash away the sand and the tears and help her to forgetfulness of the horrid sights her eyes had looked upon. When she gazed in the mirror now, she was startled. Instead of the laughing, girlish beauty that had once been hers, a creature almost unrecognizable stared back at her, a woman worn and faded, with tragic eyes. Her yellow hair, bleached by the sun and made brittle by the dry winds, had lost its soft waves, and instead of rippling back from the forehead girlishly, was strained back like that of an old woman. Her skin was sunburned and rough, her cheeks were sunken and sallow, and her eyes, no longer blue as periwinkles in an old-fashioned garden, were inflamed from the wind and sand, drawn in from constant shrinking from the glare, and faded from weeping. And still the wind blew. The wind had robbed her of her beauty, her youth, her hope, she muttered to herself. Would it some time take away her reason or her life? It shrilled round the house by night as by day, or was it the wind that she heard as she lay awake to listen to the shrill, incessant, relentless sound, the wind or the keening coyotes? In October in Virginia she would be walking through the golden leaves, with the amber sunlight all about her. She thought of the evenings, tranced with moonlight that broke in silver spray over everything, or with a silky blackness lighted by myriads of little gold stars above, and the nervous twinklings of the fireflies against the dark. A mocking-bird might pour his song at night, freighted with 1,000,000 loves and griefs and ecstasies. There was a mocking-bird at home that came back each spring to her garden, a bird with a broken wing that drooped, so that she could know for certain it was the same. But he was as jaunty, as careless, as if his wing were whole. His song was like iridescent bubbles that shimmered in the sunlight, that floated from his pulsing throat with joyous lightness. Letty realized that her homesickness was more for nature than for people, since if she went back home she would be too proud to reveal her sufferings to her friends, even the most kindly. Her pride would cut her off from their sympathy. But she could fling herself upon the grass in some secret woodland place, could give herself to abandonment of grief, and feel no shame in the presence of the trees, the birds, the grasses. They would comfort, they would heal, without hurt to her proud soul. She lived a dual life. She saw at once this sun-scorched plain, this waste of sand, whose heat rose in shimmering waves that dizzied her, those leafless mesquite bushes, the dead swords of the yucca, the bleaching bones of the cattle, gaunt carcasses where coyotes skulked and buzzards perched as hideous as gargoyles. And then she saw a far-off land, a gracious, smiling country, where pine trees were like great altar candles lifted toward the stars, where magnolias opened their waxen petals in lovely curves to show their golden hearts, where yellow jasmine climbed up into the trees to shake its laughing golden bells of perfume, where every dead stump, every post was softened and made beautiful by the grace of some wild vine. She listened to the coyote's yelp. With eager, straining ears she heard the shouts of hunters in Virginia, the summoning horns, the deep-toned musical baying of the foxhounds as they started off to begin the sport. She saw the late flowers, all in a mirage that her own will called up. The tall irises, blue and white by the old flagged walk in the garden. Each particular spot of that old garden she revisited, to live over its beauty of leaf and bloom, the lilac bushes against the brick wall, that in the spring were a mass of scented purple fit for a king. Her bed of Johnny-jump-ups that lifted piquant, saucy little faces, fresh with dew, the violets that edged the flower beds, the lavender, the old-fashioned flowers, each in its place. She would think that perhaps it was raining in Virginia. She could see the silver arrows falling straight and true, or else the veils shaken a little by the wind, but, oh, a gentle wind, or else a gossamer gauze of luminous grey that misted the air while the sun still shone. She thought of flowers springing up beneath the moisture, of tall ferns in shadowy glades, of damp rocks screened with lichens. She could hear the purling of brooks over rocky beds, of little leaping waterfalls, of murmurous rivers running to the sea, rivers of living water. It was autumn in Virginia. The colored boys would be raking up the fallen leaves and burning them in fragrant pyres. Scent of leaves burning in the crisp air. Magic like nothing else. A whole litany of memories was in the thought. Nuts would come pattering down in woodsy stillnesses, while squirrels would whisk away with their winter stores, gray squirrels or red squirrels, saucy and chattering and timidly friendly. Apples would be garnered, Albemarle pippins, winesaps, juicy and with red cheeks, cool to the touch. As the leaves fell, the grace of the limbs would show stark against the sky, with a beauty of line that no work of man could match, while the unchanging green of pines and cedars told of another spring. Here there were no trees. Was hell just a place where no trees grew, no birds sang? Hell was a place where the winds blew all the time, winds that tormented you but would not let you die. Winds that drove you almost crazy, but didn't let you know the relief that complete insanity would bring. Demon winds. Winds of the summer were bad enough, but Letty shuddered daily at thought of the winds that winter would bring. "I don't see how this house would stand in a big wind," she said apprehensively to Lige one day in the autumn. "It won't blow over, because it's got so many cracks the wind goes right through," he told with a gallant attempt at jocoseness. "But it's got no foundations, Lige. Just a rock at each corner, and one in the middle of each side." "Well, we were sort of short of rocks," he conceded. "And that's the way we have to build our houses out here. Of course, I admit that a house that's just boxed and stripped ain't so waterproof as one that's weatherboarded." She looked dubious. "Some of these days a hard wind is going to knock it over." "Some of these days you shall have sure enough house. You know the high-toned folks in these West Texas towns think they are aristocrats if they got a weatherboarded house, and a cistern instead of a water barrel, and a fence round the place."
"I miss a fence," she mourned. "I feel lost without one."
"Well, we got a windbreak, ain't we?"
She looked at the windbreak he boasted of, a short stretch of fence made of rough timber and slabs, to keep the merciless winds of winter away from the horses. Sand had piled against it like snowdrifts.
"You could bury a steer in that sand pile," remarked Lige. "If so be you had a steer left to bury."
"Don't you reckon the cattle you sent away will live?" she asked, to turn her mind away from the present.
"Sure,"
he said, with unconquerable hope.
"That'll give us a start come spring. Seed cattle, you know."
By now Letty was too deadened to feel the hungers that had so hurt her in the beginning of her life on the plains, the longings for things of the mind, for books, for music, for magazines, for easy talk of trivial interests and pleasures, for social interchange of happiness. All that her senses craved now was ease for the body, surcease from the pelting sand, the wind that was at her all the time, and for cooling water in plenty. Still the buzzards floated in the blue, their cumbersome bodies loathsomely well fed. Still at dusk the eerie shapes and shadows flitted across the plains that were so empty by day. Each day the golden gauze still hung between her and the sun. Her mouth, once a childish, adorable mouth with its kissable cleft in the upper lip, was a thin, tense line. Far off she saw sometimes a solitary horse and rider, or now and then still a covered wagon toiling across the sand, back toward the east, toward Virginia, perhaps. In Virginia soon winter would be coming, a jovial, hearty, well-protected winter, with its warmth and companionship of hearth fires, its well-stored harvests, its still loveliness of woods, where holly trees showed their bright berries against the snow, and the everlasting green of pines and cedars showed abiding life. In Texas, too, out on the plains, the winter would be coming on. A winter with no healing snows, no green reminders of the spring. A winter where lean larders would grow leaner, where a land already lonely would be more desolate, almost as empty of people as the cupboards were bare of food in the deserted ranch shacks along the way. When coyotes would hide in abandoned dugouts that once had been homes. When not even a covered wagon would be seen crossing the plains. When the wind would blow harder than ever against the frail structure. When the sky would be darkened suddenly and the northers would come. Wild stallions of the plains, swift and terrible, more than living in their might, diabolic in their cunning. The woman shuddered as she thought of what it would be like to hear again their ghostly neighing in the night. Wild figures would go sweeping over the prairies, their manes flying, their hoofs striking fire from the sand, their voices freezing one with fear. And perhaps a cyclone would come, a vast whirlwind that spiraled to the sky, that would leave destruction everywhere it passed. Oh, if one were buried deep in the grave, would one still shudder and writhe when the wind blew? She felt that the wind read her thoughts, knew all the emotions that she concealed even from her own soul. The wind slipped invisibly behind her all the time, could foreknow her actions because it knew her thoughts, even before they came into her mind. Maybe the wind sent them there. Wirt Roddy had been able to read her mind,
and now the wind did too. Who gave them both that uncanny power? Did each know that the other had it? She must be doubly careful, since the wind was so wise. She drove back impulses, chaotic, dimly felt, primitive, out of her consciousness, as she would have frightened away a flock of marauding birds from her flower garden at home. The autumn was gone, and still no rain had come. Letty counted the days off on her calendar, each day a cycle of hours that brought winter nearer. One day Lige said, "I think it'll not be long before we have a norther." "Why?" Letty asked, cold at the very thought. Perhaps if she refused to think of winter, winter would not come. Lige was shoveling the sand from the floor, where it had seeped in beneath the window during the night. A broom would mean too slow work. Letty stopped her dishwashing to watch him, as a hand stole to her heart. "Oh, I dunno. It just sort of feels like a norther. Old-timers can generally tell, one way or other, though they can't always know how they tell. If we had any cattle left, we could know by the way they act." "How?" she asked quickly, and then wished she hadn't. It was pain to hear any mention of cattle now. "They kind of bunch together with their backs to the north. Animals can tell when hard weather's coming, better than humans can. It's all the protection they got out here on the plains." "Humans haven't that much protection, have they?" she asked bitterly, almost without realizing what she said. His shovel clattered to the floor, and he turned sharply on his heel. He spoke no word, but his tight-lipped silence smote her. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind as it keened around the house, she started nervously. She heard other sounds, curious, coming from a distance above them, it seemed. What could it be? She shook Lige jerkily. "What are those noises I hear?" she cried, her voice sharp with fear. "Just the wind," he muttered drowsily. "No, above us, like birds, but there aren't any birds." His head lifted to listen for a moment, then dropped back to the pillow. "Them are wild geese honkin'. They're flying south. Sign of cold weather on the way." "Will it be soon, Lige?" she asked breathlessly. "I reckon so. They generally move that away some time ahead of the cold snap or the norther," he mumbled. He turned over and sank back into sleep. She lay there, her mouth stifled against the pillow, to keep back her sobs, while her slight body shook with sobs. Winter coming so soon. A norther. From the north the wind was coming, a terrible stallion, satanic, with flying mane and hoofs of fire. She lay wide-eyed until the dawn came. Then she saw through her eastern window a miracle of colors, when the great ball of fire that was the sun lighted the sky to glowing rose and amber and crimson, when the streaming clouds were like banners of battle flung across the heavens, and the prairie became, not a dead expanse of sand, but a hazy stretch of shimmering, opal colors, gray and gold and mother of pearl. The sky, filled with floating sand, was like cloth of gold, the light irradiating in every direction. Even her pain-dulled senses quivered to a worship of beauty as she gazed. She felt again, what she had scarcely thought to experience once more, the wounding bliss of perfect beauty. Who was it that had told her to look at the prairie some morning at sunrise and think of him? That day Letty's nerves were on edge because of her sleepless night, tautened by her fear, and tensed, although she did not realize it, by her electric prescience of the approach of the norther. She could not have analyzed her sensations, but she only felt that she might fly into little bits at any moment. Toward noon there was a strange stillness in the air. The wind had lulled, and since there was no living creature near the house now, except Lige's horse, to make any sound, the silence of the plains was oppressive, appalling. Letty felt as if the whole world were holding its breath to hear what she should say, should think. For she had something she must try to say to Lige. It would be hard, but she couldn't keep it back any longer. He sat in sombre silence by the window and looked out across the prairie where his cattle had once grazed, his far-off gaze fixed on infinity, filled with inscrutable things. When she opened her mouth to speak to him, her tongue quivered impotently. She came toward him at last, with a plate in her hand, and a cloth that she was using to dry it. Perhaps if her hands were busy with something, she could find it easier to speak. "Lige?" she began, and then stopped. "Yeah?" He lifted heavy-lidded eyes. "Lige, couldn't we go away from here?" His face hardened. "Where to?" "Oh, I don't know. Anywhere in the world, just away from here." Her hands shook, but her mouth set firmly. "This is the only house we got. We can live here for less than we can anywhere else, till things get right again." She took a step nearer in her eagerness. "But why couldn't we go to some town till spring, Lige? Other folks do it." "We got no money to pay rent. No money to move our sticks of furniture with, nor to buy any more. Towns round here are chock full of families that have left their land, and they got no work for more. I don't want to be a drifter, and where's a cowpuncher to get any work now?" His tone was harsh, though he was holding himself in hand with effort. She could see that his nerves were ragged too, perhaps because of the wind, but she could not spare him. Pain and fear made her selfish. In a way she felt pity for this haggard, unshaven man, sitting slumped there in the chair, in his dirty shirt and leather trousers, but she felt still more pity for herself. An instinct of self-preservation drove her on. "Then, Lige, if you don't want to go, can't you let me go somewhere till spring?" She faltered, her heart pounding with fear at her audacity, her whole frame trembling. He shot an astonished look at her. "Where to?" he grated. "I don't care. Anywhere in the world except here on these plains," she cried with passion. He shook his head morosely. "I ain't got no money. You know that." "Couldn't you borrow enough for a ticket for me, Lige?" He stared at her out of his heavy-lidded, inflamed eyes, as if he saw her for the first time, and then he laughed raucously. "There ain't nobody I know well enough to be on borrowing terms with that's got any money now to lend. This section's near about ruined all round. Nothing real here now but debts and drought." Her voice rose shrilly, tensed with its determination. "Couldn't you sell something then, Lige, so's you can send me?" His chair grated on the floor as he sprang up, roused by her ruthless insistence. "What in hell have I got that anybody'd want to buy?" His scornful gaze swept the room with its poor meagreness and his own shabby clothes. "I haven't got no cattle left here, not a hide nor hoof, as you well know. You wouldn't low a cow-puncher would sell his horse, or saddle, or gun, would you?" Her face whitened under his anger, but fear made her stubborn. "I've got to go, Lige, somehow. I'm just bound to go." "Why?" he jerked, trying to maintain his calm. His glittering eyes were fixed on her face as if to wrest her secret from her. "I can't stand to stay here this winter, Lige, I tell you. I just can't stand it." "So you can't take the hard licks?" His voice was scornful. She defended herself eagerly. "It ain't that, Lige. Honest. I'm scared of the wind." Her hand made wide gestures as of a wind sweeping across the plains. "Wind? That all? Huh?" "I don't mind the being poor so much, nor having to work, nor being lonesome. It's the wind. It sorta gets me, Lige. It near drives me crazy. I can't stand another winter of it now." Oh, if only he could see, could understand. His body gave a nervous jerk, expressive of the restraint he was putting on himself. "You got to stand it. There ain't no way out of it as I can see." His stiff-necked refusal to grant her plea angered her so that she gestured vehemently, and the plate dropped to the floor. "I won't face it. I won't," she cried stormily. Her words dropped into an abyss of silence, as startlingly as the plate had crashed to the floor. Even the wind was hushed. She saw Lige's tall form towering like a giant's, his face livid, his hands working. "You think too damned much of what you won't stand, and not enough of what I've got to stand," he cried hoarsely. She reeled back as if he had struck her in the face. "What have I done?" "It's what you haven't done that counts. Instead of standing by the man you married when he's having such a hard time, you mope and whine and want to run away. Quitter!" He spat his words at her. "What could any woman do in this fix?" she shrilled, aghast at him and at herself. "What has Cora done, for instance? Look at her. She's boosted Beth and chirked him up through this hard time, and kept him alive by her spunk. You think she's got the temper of a hellcat, and so she has. You hate her, but by God she's a better woman than you are. She has stuck by her man." The veins on his forehead stood out swollen and purple, and his throat moved convulsively. Then some insane instinct of self-defense, of anger that he should put Cora above her, tore from Letty a sentence she would have given much to recall. "But she loved him, and I didn't love you." She shrank back, appalled at the look on his face. If only she could take back her words. His face grew dark and terrible, like the bleak sky before the norther comes, when the storm is gathering, ready to strike. "You married me, not loving me. You lived with me, not loving me." She huddled against the wall, unable to speak. She couldn't lie to him, however much she longed to take back her words. She nodded her head, mechanically. She couldn't lie to him about a thing like that, even if he killed her. He struck his forehead once with his open palm. "Christ! What sort of a woman are you?" Then, without another word, he snatched his hat and coat from their nails against the wall. He jerked his saddle from its corner and flung open the door. She saw him catch his horse that stood shivering behind the windbreak, saddle him, and mount him. Then, without even a backward look toward the house, he dug his spurs into the horse's flanks and lashed him into a run. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Wind by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in October 2021. Chapter 13. Letty stood by the window, her gaze straining after the swirl of sand that marked Lige's going, until distance blurred it, then made it invisible. Where was he going? Not to Bev's, for he was headed in the opposite direction, away from town. No house lay along that direction for 10 miles, except the deserted shack where Sourdough had lived since her marriage had driven him from Lige's house. Sourdough had gone back to take his turn at caring for the cattle he and the other man had driven to Devil's River, so Lige could not hope to see him. Hugh Henderson had moved. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. But perhaps Lige was only riding in a mad frenzy to work off his feelings, and when his horse was run down, maybe he would start back home. Then they could talk things over quietly. He had lost his head for a time, because the wind had stirred him up too, as well as herself, had worked on his nerves till they were beyond control. That was another wrong the wind had done her. Maybe Lige had gone to see if he couldn't borrow from somebody enough money for a ticket to Virginia for her. She would sit by the window, watching for him, till he rode back, and maybe he would come to understand how she felt, and not be so hard on her. Lige had never been hard on her before. She drew a chair beside the window and sat there, still as a statue of despair, her shoulders slumped, her hands folded in her lap, her head drooping. Silence as profound as that of the grave enveloped her. Not a living thing was near her to make any noise, not a mouse gnawing in the wall, not a prairie dog that yapped above his mound, no cheerful chicken to crow, no dog to bark. Even the wind was preternaturally still, as if to add its uncanny silence as another terror. High in the blue, a buzzard floated soundlessly. The woman felt as if she were in a vacuum, a solitude so vast that no voice, no life, no motion could break the awful spell, in a world from which all living creatures save herself had fled, herself and one buzzard that lingered near the bleached bones of cattle long dead, the rotting carcasses of others. Or was he waiting for another victim? Did an abandoned soul left to perish on some desert island feel more lonely than she? Could a mortal solitary in a world from which pestilence had swept all his companions feel more companionless? This desolate desert was not a part of God's green earth where people lived. It was apart from it in time and space, a land accursed, under a spell. What would happen to her if Lige didn't come back? She hurried away from that thought as from a rattlesnake. Should she starve to death or lose her reason because of her loneliness and fear? But no, he would come back, of course. He was too good, too kind of heart to leave her like this. He had gone off in a rage because he was a man, and men couldn't understand how a woman's nerves must go to pieces because of the wind and the sand and the lonesomeness. But chiefly the wind. But when he had time to think it over, he would come back. He had felt sorry for her at first, had realized that she was just a weak, inexperienced girl that didn't know how to be a pioneer, that didn't have it in her to be a pioneer. He called her pobrecita, poor little thing. Women of the West needed to be big and strong and full of life like Cora. Then drought and hard work and wind couldn't break them. If she hadn't been there, Lige would maybe have married some Western girl, sturdy and plucky and gay, who could have helped him as he needed her. She had spoiled Lige's chance of happiness as well as her own, but then it was the wind's doing. His words about Cora scorched in her memory. She has boosted him and chirked him up through the hard times and kept him alive with her spunk. She's a better woman than you are, for she has stuck by her man. Yes, Cora had, but she hadn't. And now her man was gone away in a passion. But he'd come back, of course. But would he? Her body burned with shame as she heard again his last words to her. You married me, not loving me. You lived with me, not loving me. Christ, what sort of a woman are you? Well, what sort of a woman was she, after all? She hadn't meant to be bad. Was she bad? Life had got her in a corner and had driven her to do things she hadn't wanted to, and that didn't rightly represent her. Life in the last year had been like a norther that battered her and scared her almost to death, so she couldn't know what to do. She had just tried to struggle on the best she could, through 1 hour to the next. Maybe when Lige came back, she could find words to make him see how she felt, so that he wouldn't despise her. Men couldn't know how weak a woman's nerves were, how frail her body. Slow hours passed, and still he didn't come. Her eyes ached from staring at the yellow desert sand, the cloudless blue of the sky, the bleached bones of Lige's cattle, but still no horse and rider showed far off on the plains. The sun was settling toward the west, bright gold against the blue. Perhaps Lige had ridden farther than he realized, and it would take him longer to make his way back. Soon she would see him spurring his tired horse across the prairie to get to her before she was too frightened. He knew how easily she was scared. Still he did not come. The sun sank toward the level plain and shot his lambent rays across the heavens, broad bands of rainbow light, more beautiful than words, than even human thoughts could render. Sunset would soon be over, and Lige hadn't come home. After sunset would come the short winter dusk, and after that the dark. The thought struck a chill to her soul. The frozen finger of fear traced out her spine. Night, the dark, alone. She sprang up and ran to the other window, as if by some miracle Lige could be coming from the opposite direction. But the prairie, as she looked at it there, was as empty as the other way, with not even a far-off speck that might be a man on a horse. But in the north a little white cloud lay low on the horizon, a casual, careless little cloud like a fluff of lamb's wool. As she looked, it grew and darkened. It spread out and up, like a great dark wing across the sky. It was blue-black, in startling contrast to the azure it was covering. Oh, could it be that rain was coming? Blessed rain to break the drought and save them all from starving or from going mad. Rain that would end their troubles as by a miracle from God. Rain! Rain! She babbled incoherently, stretching out her hands, cup fashion, as if to catch the first gracious drops. Lige could smile again if it rained. He could be his old, cheerful, kindly self, not the haggard, wretched man, with his nerves shattered by suspense and worry. Rain now would put out water in the water-holes, would make the grass grow green in the spring, would make next year a time of hope instead of torment. "Thank God for the rain!" She flung open the door as if to rush out to meet the rain, to let its cooling drops fall on her face, her hair, her body. But an icy chill struck her, and she knew the truth. No rain, but a norther, was what the cloud meant. That was why the wind had been so crafty and so still. It was gathering its forces for a norther, to trick her and to break her spirit when she was here alone. Almost immediately the wind was upon her with a terrible impact. She shrieked and whirled back to flee into the house to escape it. It should not catch her yet. She almost fell across the threshold and slammed the door behind her, though it took all her strength to close it. She felt that a sentient, brute force was exerted to oppose her, but desperate fear lent her power, and she got it closed. Then she stood in the middle of the room and struck her clenched hands together. The norther had known that Lige was gone, and it had planned to trap her. She stood there tense, defiant for a time. When she looked out again, creeping to the window stealthily to see what her enemy was doing, she saw that the sand blew in billowing curtains between her and the sky, vast folds that twisted and writhed in mocking shapes. What monstrous, unseen terrors did those curtains hide? Suddenly she was aware of the cold of the room. The fire had gone out, and in her absorption in her wretchedness of spirit, she had not been conscious of her physical discomfort. But now the drop in temperature roused her to realization. With shaking fingers she set about rebuilding the fire in the round-bellied stove in the room. No need of one in the kitchen, for the thought of food was enough to choke her. She made repeated efforts before she got the blaze going again, with mesquite roots and cow chips gathered from the prairie as fuel. She held out her numb fingers toward the warmth. Outside, the curtains of sand were stretching higher, higher, until they blotted out the last faint blue of the fading sky and hid the round ball of the sun. She must have light, for soon the dark would be there. She quickly filled her lamp with kerosene, cleaned the chimney, trimmed the wick so that the light might shine as clearly as possible. She must be sure of light before the dark fell. Night was almost on her, and Lige hadn't come home. New fears came to harass her. Perhaps his horse had stumbled, his foot in a prairie dog hole, and had thrown his rider. Maybe the horse had broken his leg so that Lige would have to walk all the way home. That would take him longer, of course. But he would surely come. When darkness stole into the room, she lighted the lamp, turned it up to shine brightly, and set it on the center of the table. She felt afraid of the windows and started to pull down a shade. How terrible if the norther should peer in and see her. But her hand stayed in its motion as a thought arrested her. She ought to leave the window clear and the light burning brightly so that Lige could see how to come home. In the storm, in the driving sand, it would be hard for him to find his way, and she must leave the light to guide him. "I've got to make it easy for him to come home," she muttered aloud. What if Lige should lose his way? What if he were even now driven helpless over the prairie, unable to know in what direction his home lay, with even his coyote sense of direction lost in this blinding sandstorm. "But I reckon the horse could find his way home, even in a sandstorm," she answered her fear. She spoke aloud as if the sound of her voice would make the statement more emphatic, and hence more true. Yes, horses knew more about weather than human beings did. What was it Lige had said? "It's their only protection out here on the plains." The horse would surely bring his master safe home. Still, he did not come. Fears worried her, as the heel flies had nagged the helpless cattle incessantly. If only she could know where he was. He had never left her alone at night before. He knew how scared she was, what a coward about the dark and the wind. He knew how the wind almost drove her crazy when it blew like this. The wind, as if in answer to her thought of it, dashed itself against the frail house that creaked and shivered with the force of it. She could hear the timbers straining, creaking. Would they hold? How could the shack withstand such violence? Only a little house, boxed and stripped, as Lige had said, set up on rocks laid in the top of the ground, just a rock at each corner, and one here and there along the side. The icy winds came in through the cracks in the floor, through the crevices in the wall, through the crannies under the doors and windows, so that now and then the high flame of the lamp flared a bit in a gust that seemed to come from nowhere and from everywhere at once. Lige didn't come. Was he coming at all? She thought of that other night, how long ago, when she had been terrified in the storm at night at Bev's and Cora's house. But then the children had been with her to companion her even in their sleep, and Lige had come to save her from the terror of the wind. It was the wind that had driven her to promise to marry him. And now, where was Lige? Would he ever come back to her? Wouldn't he come back to save her, even if he despised her? He was so kind, always, until that morning. He was a little crazy too, with the wind and the drought and worrying over things, she muttered to herself. Else he wouldn't have left me like he did. The wind shook the house vehemently, as if to wrench it from its foundations, tear it timber from timber. Letty cried aloud in terror, "Lige! Lige!" But she had no answer, save that which the wind gave. Sobbing, she huddled against the wall, her fingers twisted around each other, her face distorted, her shoulders shaking. "Lige, if you don't come home, I'll go crazy in this wind," she wailed. Only the shouting norther gave reply. Was he lost in the storm so that he would freeze, alone on the prairie? If only she might know how to find him and bring him home, to shelter and warmth. But what could she do in this storm? "Nothing, nothing," she moaned as she paced the floor impotently. She shook with horror at thought of Lige at the mercy of the norther out on the plains, the wind that was so cunning and so strong, like a devil. The wind that went sweeping over the plain like a demon horse, with his mane flying, his hoofs striking fire, ready to trample her to death. Did she imagine it? Was she going crazy? Or did she hear the thundering hoof-beats of a galloping horse? She huddled in panic against the table, one hand on her heart. A shrill neigh sounded outside the door. She went almost mad with terror for a moment, and then she sprang forward, as hope leaped to life again. She flung the door wide open. "Lige! Lige!" she cried. A tall figure swept in out of the blackness and slammed the door, to shut out the wind that would follow him. "Lige!" she cried, tears of joy running down her cheeks. But it was not Lige. As he swept off his broad-brimmed hat, she saw that Wirt Roddy stood before her. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Wind by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in October 2021. Chapter 14. Letty reeled back, astounded and bewildered. The shock of seeing Wirt Roddy where she had looked for Lige made her clutch at the table for support. "You? You?" she stammered, passing one hand before her eyes to clear their vision. If she looked closer, surely she would see it was Lige after all. "Yes, it's me," he said gravely. Then her fear for her husband's safety sprang up redoubled. "Has anything happened to Lige? Where is he?" "He won't be home just yet." His level gaze met hers, but non-committally, revealing nothing of what she wished to know. She clutched his arm. "You've seen him?" He nodded. "But where is he?" The words tumbled over each other, and her clutch tightened on his arm. "He's back at Rube Hitchcock's place." Still his eyes, his words, cheated her of the truth. She beat her clenched hands together. "But why? Why don't he come home?" He looked at her for a moment, as if in doubt whether to tell her the truth or not. At last he spoke, grudgingly. "He can't. He's drunk." "But I never saw Lige take a drink. He don't drink," she gasped, incredulous. "Sure. That's why he's knocked out now. Went to his head, you see, because he wasn't used to it." "But didn't he remember about me?" Her voice broke. "Didn't he think of me being left here alone?" "He was laid out like a log when I saw him. He won't do no thinking about anything for a spell, I reckon. He's caved." His tone was devoid of feeling, as if he were trying to keep feeling out of it. She gave a low sob. "The fellers said he was trying to borrow money for something or other, they didn't know what. Seems he didn't say, only swore he had to have it, but they were cleaned out too, same as him. When he found he couldn't get the money, he called for the red-eye and turned loose on it." "Oh, oh, oh," she moaned, the back of one hand pressed against her mouth. "No need to worry. He'll be all right after a while. Sleep off his bat, have a helter-split headache for a day, and then he'll be as gamesome as ever. I know, I've been through it." His words brought no comfort to her. "So I came to tell you how he was. He'll not be back for a time," he explained casually. Her eyes of misery looked up into his. "That was kind of you," she stammered. "Aren't you going to ask me to have a seat?" he asked as he looked at her expectantly. Terror fluttered wildly at her heart in an instant, fear of Lige's anger. "Oh, no, I couldn't. Lige wouldn't like it, him being away, you know." "Lige left you by yourself," he countered. "But he's drunk." "I thought you were scared of the wind," he jibed. The panic that leaped into her eyes answered him. "Oh, yes, yes." "Then you don't want me to go away and leave you here alone in the storm?" She shuddered, but her gaze met his firmly. "I got to. On account of Lige, you know." The wind struck the shack with concentrated fury, as if determined to wreck it, while its shrill clamor filled the air. "And what about me?" he asked quietly. "I wouldn't think you'd send a dog out into this norther."
"But Lige wouldn't understand. He's mad with me already, and he didn't like you coming to the house the other 2 times."
Her eyes pleaded with him to sympathize with her situation, to understand her dilemma. He smiled grimly. "I thought you were so tender-hearted about cattle and animals and all. I reckon you haven't stopped to think that the nearest ranch house is 10 miles in either direction. My horse is beat out now. I couldn't make it." She was silent for a moment, her face contorted, her body quivering with the strain of her struggle to decide what she must do. If only Lige were there. The man's voice went on. "No ranch woman would turn anybody, even a tramp, even a criminal, away in a storm like this with no place to go. It would mean my death, sure. Do you want to have any blood on your hands?" With a shudder she stared at her hands, expecting to see visible stains there. The wind shrilled outside, the windows rattled violently, the lamplight flared in the gusts. The woman gave a despairing gesture of assent. "You needn't be afraid of me," he said gravely as he removed his coat and laid it on the table. His old mocking manner was gone. There was no gleam of laughter in his dark eyes, no flick of irony at his mouth, no satiric shrug of his shoulders, but in their place a seriousness that was restrained and stern. What experience, what emotion had changed him so? Letty sank into her chair, relieved in spite of herself that she was not to be left again to the horror of solitude in the storm.
"The wind nearly drives me crazy," she cried. "It was you that first made me afraid of it."
His face grew more sober. "Yes, I reckon I've got that on my conscience. And it maybe pesters me more than some other things that might seem worse."
"It was cruel," she accused him, her blue eyes fixed on his face. "It's made me miserable ever since I came out here. I never can get the fear of the wind out of my mind, day nor night. You put it on me like a curse. And I had never done anything to harm you."
"I'm sure sorry," he said tensely. "I'd give a lot to take back those words. I feel like a low-down hound."
"I'm always looking for a cyclone, like you described it. I lie awake at night thinking it's coming toward me, a big whirlwind that reaches to the sky."
"But they don't come so often, even in this section," he said with attempt at cheerfulness.
"One would be enough."
"Chances are it won't ever come your way," he said soothingly, as to a child. "You were such a pretty little trick and so bashful, I couldn't help teasing you. I ought to be hung for it." She shook her head and spoke with concentrated bitterness.
"It wasn't only just teasing. Everything you said about the wind has come true to me, except the cyclone. It has ruined my looks, my nerves, and my disposition. It's trying to break me, and it will get me yet."
He gazed at her for a moment in silence, and then spoke, more to himself than to her. "Your hair is not so yellow and wavy as it used to be. Your skin's not so white and soft. Your cheeks aren't pink anymore, and your eyes aren't so blue as they used to be."
"It's the wind has ruined me," she cried harshly, accusing destiny, the fates, as well as him. "The wind and the sand and the lonesomeness, but mostly the wind."
"It's damned hard on the women out here," he muttered, twisting his moustache nervously. "I've thought of you 1,000 times when you were up against it at first."
"But you never came to see me. You didn't show me a way out of it," she cried passionately. He put his hands together between his knees and gave her a long, long, thoughtful look. "No, I didn't come to see you, nor show you a way out. That's one thing the angel with the big book will have writ down to my credit at the last day, even if there isn't much else to keep it company. I wanted to come, and I kept away." "Why? Why?" she flung at him. He faced her steadily, his look of evasion gone as well as his mockery.
"I thought it all over and wrestled it out. I was more than half in love with you, and I figured that there wasn't nothing a galoot like me had to offer a little girl like you. Even if I was to have asked you to marry me, and I wasn't a marrying man, I wasn't fit for you."
"Oh!" she cried, struggling to comprehend, to piece the facts together in her mind so that she could know the truth. He was not lying to her now, she knew, nor was he evading. The moment had come when he spoke frankly. He went on.
"And so I knew I better keep away. Girls had trusted me before and come to regret it, to wish they hadn't. I didn't want it to be that way with you."
She was trying to take it all in. "But you did come. Twice," she challenged him, "when it was too late to give me any advice."
He nodded. "Yes. When a feller's got a maggot in his brain, keeping away don't always help. I came to think that if I'd see you again, I'd maybe find you weren't so pretty nor so sweet as I remembered you, and then it'd be easy for me to steer the other way. But I reckon I was just fooling myself. I was just an excuse I gave myself for coming to see you."
"But you said I wasn't so pretty when you saw me."
Her words struggled forth, trying to find some flaw in his logic.
"You said my hair wasn't yellow, nor my eyes so blue, nor my skin so white."
"No, that's true. The wind had hurt them, but that didn't make any difference." He spoke with savage constraint. "Beauty lies deeper in complexion. The real you hadn't been touched."
"But you kept away."
"Yes, it wasn't easy, by God, but I did. I knew I had to."
"Yes, you had to," she whispered.
"So you see that's how it was with me," he brought out as if speech were difficult.
She made no answer, for words would not piece themselves together in her brain. Her very thoughts were inchoate, striving against each other, refusing to come clear. His sombre eyes gazed at her intently.
"Life has been pretty damned hard for you, hasn't it, little woman?"
His tone of sympathy released her pent-up emotion, and she smote her palms together. "Oh, it has been torment!"
"Pobrecita!"
The word recalled the other who had used a pitying endearment to her. "Oh, it wasn't Lige's fault. He's good. It's this country, this terrible country where it never rains, and no green things grow, and no birds sing."
"Some years there are birds." he protested with a trace of his old humor. She gave a rasping laugh.
There are none here now, except buzzards waiting for their prey.
He smiled grimly. They are well enough fed now.
Yes, they are the only things in this God-forgotten land that isn't starved or starving. Nothing here but wind and sand, till it's enough to drive me crazy.
She made a wild, rending gesture with her hands. He watched her in silence for a moment, twisting his moustache, a frown of uncertainty on his forehead, his eyes restless. You need to get away for a while, for a change, he said.
I'll go mad if I don't, but I can't, she cried, bitter remembrance surging back into her mind. That's what was the trouble with Lige today. I hounded him to get money from somewhere to send me back to Virginia to stay till spring.
You ought to go.
Yes, if I could rest and get my breath from the wind, I could be myself again. Oh, I know I'm not myself now. I feel like I'll jump out of my skin if I have to stay here through another winter and face these devil winds.
He drew a long breath and then spoke rapidly, as if his mind were made up and he must not let himself think again. Come away with me, and you shan't need to face them again, ever. She shrank back, aghast.
Oh, no, no! How could I?
He leaned toward her eagerly, his hands outstretched, his words coming with swift passion. You need to get away. You've got to think of yourself now. If you stay here, it's like you say, you'll die or go loco. And what good would that do Lige or anybody? She felt the falseness of his logic, but was unable to argue convincingly as he did. She could only protest.
Oh, no, I couldn't treat him like that. He's been kind to me, and he's had so much to bear lately.
He'd soon get over it. Men do. The old light of mockery was in his eyes.
Not Lige. And anyway, it would be wrong.
Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what he was asking. It's wrong to commit suicide, isn't it? He demanded.
Yes, that's a sin.
Then to stay on here when you know yourself it's more than you can stand is committing suicide, isn't it? He leaned nearer and laid his burning hand on her wrist. She shivered and shrank away, but she could not marshal her words to refute his argument. The wind smote the house with redoubled fury. The timbers creaked and strained as if making a violent effort to hold together, and she could feel the structure rock and sway, with threats of leaving its foundations. She turned to him with sudden, desperate appeal. "Why can't you lend us the money for a ticket for Virginia, so I can go home?" "Not on your life." He shook his head vehemently. "That would mean me nor Lige either would ever see you again. I won't work it like that." She gave a little, choking sob.
"Oh, I'd go down on my knees to beg anybody for a ticket home."
"I'll give you anything but that. Anything but that, I swear it. But I won't put the country between you and me."
"You say you didn't want me to be like those others that trusted you and were sorry,"
she half whispered, her eyes on his as in a trance. He drew one hand across his forehead. "I don't know what I want. Except that I want you." His passionate words seemed to echo and re-echo through the room, their sound lingering in her ears above the clamor of the storm.
"No, No.
Listen. His voice was tense and stern, almost savage in its vehemence. We can leave as soon as daylight comes and can make for the railroad. We can be a long ways off from here before Lige gets over his drunk. And then he can't stop us.
No, no.
Her words were an incoherent cry, unreasoning, instinctive. But Lige can't do no more for you now, the way he's fixed. And I've got money. I'm big rich, I tell you, and I'll give you anything you want, take you anywhere you want to go.
What sort of woman would I be? She cried, as memory crashed in upon her once more.
He drew back, and then he shook himself as in a dream. Make it any way you like. You can get a divorce and we'll get married if you say so. I want you and I've got to have you. Don't matter how. Blood beat in her head, making it hard for her to think, but her thoughts struggled as through an enveloping darkness and constriction, through resisting forces.
That would be as wicked as the other way.
In the name of hell, how? Sincere amazement was in his face, his voice. She made a gesture of contempt.
To treat Lige like that when he's trusted me? It's not his fault that he's down now. The drought and the wind have been more than he could stand, and they've nearly driven him crazy. Same as me.
He caught her hand in a tense grip that hurt her. Listen to me, Letty. You don't love him, and you never did. And I'm willing to bet anything, all I've got, that you do love me. His tone was triumphant, his eyes exulted over her. She wrenched her hand away and faced him in defiance.
You've got no right to say such a thing.
You won't deny it, he taunted. His eyes deliberately tried now to assert their old mastery over her emotions. His very hand seemed menacing, his lips curled in a smile. An icy terror ran along her spine, a frozen fire in her veins. She turned to flee. Better to run away out on the prairie than to stay here. Better the madness of the storm and the dark than this. What was that roaring in her ears? Was it merely the sound of the wind outside? Wild, clamorous wailing like a troop of souls from hell. She could vision the norther racing toward her across the prairies, a wild stallion breathing death, his hoofs of fire ready to trample her down to destruction. Fear had her by the throat as she paused, her hand clutching the doorknob. A shrill, prolonged neighing came from outside the door.
Was that your horse?
She jerked. He laughed at her panic. Quien sabe? Who knows? A swirl of wind swept into the room from the cracks in the floor, from the slits in the walls, from the crevices under the windows. The flame in the kerosene lamp flared up brightly for an instant, flickered, went out. Her terror was so extreme that every muscle, every nerve was tense as with violent action. Her fear, her wild anger against the wind, against this man, tautened her body in a strain like that of mortal physical struggle. Her breath came fast and faster, her heart beat suffocatingly, her skin was drenched with icy perspiration, her whole form shuddered as she felt the enveloping horror of darkness added to her terror of the wind and of this man.
"Who blew that lamp out?"
she shrilled. "I don't know," he answered, coming closer to her in the darkness.
"You did. You know you did."
Fear was throttling her. "I swear I didn't," he said, as his hand caught hers.
"Who was it then?"
she chattered. "It was the wind."
"The wind!"
Just at that moment, a violent blast shook the house, as if to tear it in pieces and send the splinters over the wide plain. The door crashed open, and a roaring blast rushed into the room. Half swooning with terror of the invisible, the unearthly, Letty flung herself into Werdroddy's arms, and clung round his neck as a drowning person would.
"The wind! The wind! Don't let the wind get me!"
"I won't," he said hoarsely, as his arms closed round her. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Wind by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Availle in October 2021. Chapter 15. The first faint glimmerings of dawn found Letty sitting huddled by the eastern window, wrapped in an old blanket, waiting for the day. She had sat there most of the night. Light-headed for want of sleep, she had not slept for 2 nights now, she was trying to think. The wind that had wailed at her all night like a demon lover had lulled now. Was it by a freakish turn that a norther may take, or was it by a miracle? And so her mind was not battered and bruised now by its noise, by its rushings at the house to overturn it. It had quieted down so that she could think. It would be at her again in a little while, but in the brief interval of stillness she must think things through. But thought was hard. She tried to piece together the happenings of the past few hours. What had she done? What had she done? Dull, leaden misery weighed her down. One act of delirium that must wreck her whole life. A few mad moments out of a lifetime, that must yet ruin the whole. There was no justice anywhere. She hadn't been responsible when you looked at it right. She hadn't been herself. It was the wind that was to blame. Nobody ought to hold a crazy person responsible for what he did, and the wind had made her crazy. She could see things clearly now, because it wasn't blowing. She must think fast before it started up again, because the wind did things to her brain that wouldn't let her think. The east began to glimmer with the dawn. Only 1 dawn ago she had thought herself as wretched as life could possibly make her. But how fortunate she had been then compared with now. Then Lige had been with her, good, kind, faithful Lige. Where was Lige now? She pictured him lying laid out like a log, dead drunk because of her unreasonable complaints and pleas. Poor Lige. Her heart surged with rage as she thought of that other man lying there in the room, sodden with sleep. What of the moment when he would wake and she should have to face him? Oh, worse than murderer than he was. Why didn't God strike him dead? Perhaps he had struck him in his sleep. She turned toward the bed where he lay, a long mound under the heaped-up covers, and listened intently. Yes, he was breathing. He could sleep. He would rise to meet the new day with none of the anguish that was hers. But what of her, tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow? Soon Lige would be coming home. Home. She gave a rasping laugh as the incongruity of the word struck her. He would come back, she knew. Sober and remorseful, he would think of her. He would almost kill his horse riding back to relieve her terrors, to tell her he was sorry for the way he had acted. He would be gentle, now that his frenzy of shock and anger was over, kind as he had always been. So kind. Dear Lige. A flood of warm tenderness for him rose within her. For the first time since her marriage she began to appreciate her husband. She had longed for romance, she told herself, but what lover of romance had been more tender, more considerate than Lige? She had dreamed of a cavalier with plumes and sword, a gallant figure. But what knight of legend or of history had battled more bravely against heavy odds, had been more truly chivalrous than Lige had? And always so just, so generous. She looked back on what she had held as grievances against him. She had blamed him for her sufferings, but what had he done but take her from an unbearable situation, make her his wife, give her a home? Just a poor shack, but the best he could afford. But she hadn't made any sort of home for him. She had been selfish, wrapped in her own wrongs, cold, hard to him. She gave a low sob as she thought how much happier she might have made his life if she had been brave and loving. And he had never once complained, until yesterday when she had driven him mad. She could see now how he must have been tortured in soul all along, where she was too selfish to care. She saw his chiseled, haggard face, his burning eyes, his tall frame shrunken and stooped from his worry and privation, but bearing his load without outcry or complaint. Poor Lige, he'd had so much to bear, and she hadn't helped him at all. She had only loaded him with more. Tears ran down her cheeks, and her heart softened incredibly as the realization of the truth came to her. She loved him, Lige, her husband. Now at last she saw him for the man he was, and loved him as he deserved. She clasped the thought to her soul, as a mother clasps a little newborn baby, so novel, so strange, so precious beyond words. How glad he would be when he came home, and she put her arms about his neck and told him that she loved him. She would kiss him. She had never before, she had always merely suffered his kisses. But now she would make it up to him. Now that the wind wasn't blowing and she had a chance to think, she could see the truth. The wind and the sand had hidden the truth from her before. Then, like a sword of ice and fire, remembrance pierced her. She was no longer worthy to be called his wife. What sort of woman was she, in very truth? Her body writhed. How could she tell Lige anything now? How could she tell him the truth? Yet, how could she lie to him? She saw his honest eyes searching hers. She couldn't lie to him. Now, when for the first time she knew what it was to love him, she must slay his love for her. If only she could somehow make him understand that it was the wind and not she herself that was responsible. But no, he couldn't see that. And even if he did, that would not heal his hurt, his shame. The more he loved her, the more his shame would be, now. Infinite compassion for Lige's suffering swept over her, so that for a moment she forgot her own. If only she could bear it all herself and spare Lige. He had had so much to stand for her. What would he do when he knew the truth? She started up in panic. Would he kill her? Western men, she knew, had stern codes for the morality of their women. But if he killed her, that would be best. Then she'd be out of it all. But if he shot Wirt Roddy, or were shot by him? Her imagination lifted a curtain for her, and she seemed to see a fight to the death between those two men, big and tall and fearless. She glanced to the wall where the guns hung. Maybe she'd better hide them before Lige came home, or word Roddy woke up. But no, she mustn't do that, for word Roddy had his gun, and it would be murder to take Lige's away from him. Her clairvoyant visioning showed her a scene where one man lay dead with a bullet through his heart. But which one was it? She strained to see, but could not discern the features, for the wind seemed to blow a veil of sand over the face. She saw, in fancy, another man, the murderer, led away by the sheriff who always got his man. If he turned to flee in an effort to escape, the sheriff would spit quickly and then shoot. The dawn glimmered more brightly in the empty sky. Soon sunrise would come. "Will you sometimes watch a sunrise on the plains and think of me?" Could she ever see a sunrise again, anywhere on God's earth, without her mind being soiled and tortured by the remembrance of him? Oh, if only the sun need never rise at all any more. Day would soon be here. What would it bring? She must make a fire so that Lige would be warm when he came home. She emptied the stove of its dead ashes of last night and clumsily built a fire. She was not used to doing that, for Lige always did it for her. Would he ever do it for her again? At last, when the flame cracked and leaped, and the round-bellied stove began to glow, she turned about. The man had risen and was sitting in the chair by the window, staring fixedly at her. His black hair was rumpled, his face was swollen with the heaviness of his sleep. Self-loathing looked at her out of his bloodshot eyes. Cold hatred possessed her for a moment, so that she had a mad, blinding vision of how one could commit murder, and then she felt sick, in body as well as in spirit. Her heart beat to suffocation, her limbs trembled violently. They stared at each other like two guilty souls meeting in hell. Silence like crossed swords clashed between them. Letty felt that she could lift the weight of the world more easily than she could speak a word to this man. At last he spoke, with sardonic attempt at jauntiness, as if he thought by ignoring the situation he could wave it away by a word. "Good morning." She drew a long, shuddering breath, but said nothing. The room was growing lighter now, as dawn progressed. The furniture cast grotesque shadows on the floor, and the round stove made a circle of light as well as of heat in the room, while it crackled cheerfully, disregardful of the situation as the man. He made another attempt at conversation. "We better have a little snack and make our getaway before long." Oh, the callous, unfeeling heart of him! This stung her to speech. "And you can think that I'm going away with you?" Genuine surprise widened his eyes. "Sure. Why not?" She turned on him with a look of loathing, but she spoke no word in answer. "What else can you do now?" he demanded. She flung her head back. "I'd make my bed with the coyotes and the rattlesnakes before I'd go away with you." "So?" He nodded slightly, in meditative way, as he tried to puzzle out her feelings. She could not endure the look in those dark, bloodshot eyes, so she turned to the window and gazed out. Outside, the light was clear enough now to show the freakish effects of the storm. Sand lay in billows, wind waved along the plains. Some spaces were swept bare as a floor, while in others were long, irregular mounds where there had been some slight obstruction to catch the sand and form a nucleus for a drift. The windbreak, built to form a slight shelter for Lige's cattle, when he had any cattle, had caught the full force of the drive, and there sand lay piled against it in a deep drift, like snow in a northern gale. She turned round again to hear what the man was saying to her.
"But I'd think to go away with me would be the best way out. No?"
"No!" He chose his words cautiously, as a man picks his steps when he is walking in a bed of prickly pear.
"You mean you hold it against me? On account of last night? You mean you can't forgive me?"
Her tortured eyes met his. "Can you ever forgive yourself?" His shoulders heaved and he spoke harshly, with a harshness that might have been against himself, not her.
"No, but I'll make it up to you."
"How could you? Ever?"
"Well—"
He thrust at her in self-defense, while the look of self-loathing in his eyes belied his words.
"You can't throw the whole blame on me. Weren't you willing?"
She shuddered and beat her clenched hands together impotently. "I wasn't! God in heaven knows I wasn't! It wasn't me! It was the wind that drove me crazy."
"You'll not be likely to make your husband see it that way, huh?"
he jeered. Her shoulders sagged, her whole defiant pride seemed to collapse. "No, I know that," she said with dull misery.
"It ain't safe to leave you here,"
he argued.
"No telling what he may take it in his head to do when he finds out the facts."
"I know that," she said.
"And he'll sure find out."
"Oh, yes. I'll tell him." Memory flashed her a picture of Sourdough polishing his gun, as he sang softly, afterward Roddy's last visit to the ranch.
"If you come monkeying with my Lula gal, I tell you what I'll do. I'll shoot you up with my 44 and carve you through and through."
Why, Sourdough himself would follow the man down and shoot him as he would a rattlesnake, would grind him under his heel as he would a vingaroon, a whip-tailed scorpion. What train of tragedies had she not started? But not she, the wind, the devil wind, that could take so many forms to torment and to madden her. But Roddy tried another tack.
"When we get to Fort Worth, if you want it that way, I'll buy you a ticket to Virginia and start you home."
Wild hope leaped up in her eyes for an instant, and then despair came again. "I couldn't go back home to Virginia now." He smiled sardonically.
"So you figure out that I've queered the whole world for you, huh?"
"Yes," came in a broken cry. He gnawed at his moustache in silence, a deep frown denting his forehead. At last he rose leisurely, stretched his tall frame and stood looking down at her for a moment, as if measuring forces with her, as if asking himself could it be possible that the will of that slight creature could hold against his own. She looked at him, speechless. How tall he was! He had reached his decision, made up his mind, and now announced his plan casually.
"I'm not going to leave you here. Your baby face would spill the truth to your husband, and he'd take a shotgun to us both."
"He ought to." He smiled indulgently as at a foolish child. Well, I'd something rather not kill him unless I'm obliged to. And I don't care to stop breathing myself just yet. So the only way out is to pack up and vamoose before he comes. So, get ready.
She only looked her contempt at him. And this was the man that had haunted her dreams for almost a year. Had he been like this all along, and she too ignorant, too blind to see? Or had he crumbled to pieces overnight? The veins of his temples swelled and throbbed as he stared at her.
So you think you're not coming?
He said with a derisive laugh. I'm not coming, she answered inflexibly. A dark flush mottled his face, making it almost purple, and his hands clenched.
You are coming, I tell ya, if I have to throw you over my saddle like a sack of meal.
Then you'd have a sack of meal that way, but you wouldn't have me. Her scorn was like the lash of a whip across his livid face. He strode forward and seized her wrist like a vice.
You're coming, by God! I'll show you.
Mad terror of him clutched her again, such terror as she had known last night, before despair had come. She wrenched from his grasp, and without thinking what she did, she snatched the gun from the wall. He gave a jeering laugh.
Oh, so you think you'll shoot me, eh?
Yes, I will. Her hands trembled so that she thought the rifle would surely clatter to the floor. She had never held a gun in her hands before.
I know you, he scoffed. You wouldn't hurt a horned toad, and you couldn't if you wanted to.
He advanced closer.
Stop your damned foolishness and get ready to come on with me. I'm not going to have a double killing here because you've got no brains. And I'm not going to leave you here by yourself to be shot.
He spoke between clenched teeth, his eyes savage. Palsied by terror, she reeled backward to escape him. In an instant, his hand seized her arm to take away the rifle. Scarcely knowing what she did, she blindly pulled the trigger. A sharp crack followed, and a puff of smoke. His hand released her to clutch at his breast. A look of astonishment came over his face. He grasped the edge of the table for support a moment, and then lurched heavily to the floor, his fall jarring the flimsy house and making the dishes bounce and rattle on the kitchen table. Her astonishment was as complete as his own. She stared at him while the gun clattered to the floor, and she saw, for the first time, that it was the target rifle he had brought her for a present, and which she had never touched before. Letty stared in a daze at the man lying there, her first impression being that he was so tall. It did not seem possible that she had shot him, but she must have. Was he badly hurt? She bent over him to listen to his breathing. It was fainter and fainter with each gasp, and each exhalation brought a trickle of blood from his breast. His dark eyes still stared up at her, unbelievingly, till, in a few moments, they were covered by a light film. One hand twitched, then was still. The eyelids gradually closed, all except for a narrow slit, through which the dark eyes seemed to stare at her, incredulous, accusing. She touched his wrist and found no pulse there. She laid her hand over his heart, to feel no slightest flutter of motion. But of course it would begin again. It couldn't be possible that he was dead. One couldn't be alive 1 minute, so full of life, and then dead right after. Life didn't work that way. He was only asleep, as he had been through the night. He would wake soon.
He would wake and be very angry that she had shot him. But he must get up soon before Lige came. Lige wouldn't like to find him here like this. She crouched on the floor beside him, waiting for him to rouse. The lids would lift slowly, the moustache would twitch, a canny smile would come over the lips, and the man would be all awake in an instant. That is the way it would come. But he lay inert. She put a hand on his forehead and found it chill. But her hand was cold too, so that didn't mean anything. Then she began to realize, slowly, so that her reason might not topple. The man was dead. She had killed him. She, who had never hurt any living thing before, who could not have harmed a mouse caught in a trap. She gave a low scream, and then she clapped her hand over her mouth. She mustn't lose control of herself, lest she go to pieces. She must keep her head, so she could think what to do. Soon Lige would come riding over the prairies, and what could she say to him? Soon the sheriff would come and put handcuffs on her to lead her away to prison. It wouldn't be any use to try to run, for the sheriff always got his man. But if only she could hide the body somewhere, then the sheriff wouldn't know about it. No one would know, for who would come to look for the man here? They wouldn't know he was dead, and they'd think he had gone back to Fort Worth. If they asked her, she would tell them he had gone back to Fort Worth. That was the idea. She must hide the body. But where? She looked wildly round the shack to find no hint of aid. She thought of the old Negro folk song that Mammy used to sing. I run to the rock for to hide my face. The rock cried out, no hiding place here. The lines beat in her brain. She sprang up to flee. She would run away before the sheriff started after her. She couldn't stay here in this room anyhow, with the murdered man lying there, accusing her with his quiet face, his still hands. But where could she escape to? She looked out through the window to the prairies, freaked with their goblin patterns of sand, in windrows and hollows and little mounds. One couldn't hide there, where there were no trees, no clumps of bushes, no fence corners to conceal one. Anyone could see so clearly here for such incredible distances that the sheriff would find her so easily. Then her eyes lighted on the windbreak almost at the house, where the sand had piled in a huge drift. Lige's words flashed into her mind. You could bury a steer there, if so be you had a steer left to bury. Why, that was the solution. Why hadn't she thought of it before? She would bury the dead men there in the deep sand, and then nobody need know what had happened, not the sheriff, not even Lige. And then Lige needn't be hurt by knowing the truth. But she must manage it fast, for Lige might come riding over the plains any time now. She flung open the door and measured the distance with her eyes. Just a little way. Surely she could drag the body that far, like a sack of meal. She clutched the dead man by the armpits and began to drag him toward the door. He was heavy, and the task was hard. Could she make it? Terror gave her supernormal strength, and she struggled on. Farther, a little farther at a time. She panted and heaved, and cold sweat ran down her body, but she would not give up. Lige and the sheriff might be coming any time now. With prodigious effort she got him out through the doorway, and slowly, Inch by inch she dragged him to the windbreak. His body made a long path in the sand, as if a huge serpent had drawn its length across it. She fell face forward on the sand to rest and get her breath for a moment, but fear soon goaded her up. She must finish before Lige came, so that he needn't ever know. She ran to get the kitchen shovel to use as a spade. She tried to dig out a grave in the sand, but the treacherous stuff mocked her efforts, sliding back almost as fast as she shoveled it away. She had always known that the sand hated her, just like the wind did. The sand was the tool of the wind, its weapon with which it tried to break her. But she would outwit it. She must. At last, with frantic efforts, she had a place made. She dropped the shovel for terror, for a song came to her ears. From what time or space? From what other world than this? Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie, where the wild coyotes will howl over me, in a narrow grave just 6 by 3. Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie. No, no, she told herself wildly, it was not the corpse singing. But they buried him there on the lone prairie, where the buzzards wait and the winds blow free, in a narrow grave just 6 by 3. They buried him there on the lone prairie. She must hurry, and get the body buried, lest the corpse begin to sing. She dragged the body into its place and composed it decently with her shaking hands. She crossed the hands over the breast, for a corpse must always have it so. She pressed the eyelids down over the slit in the eyes. The sand mustn't get into those dead eyes. He was so tall. Then she began to cover him over with the sand that slipped through her fingers, that slid off the shovel with devilish trickiness. But she outwitted it. She kept on until she had it heaped in place. There. The sand was in a long, smooth mound now. She had made it so that it looked like the work of the wind. Well, wasn't it the work of the wind? At last she was satisfied and rose to go. She gave a final glance at her achievement. The mound was high and fairly smooth, and it covered the body so that nothing was visible. Who looking at it would suspect that a murdered man lay buried there? Lige wouldn't guess, nor even the sheriff. Everything was all right. She turned to face the east. The sun had half risen above the horizon and shone like a golden wheel whose spokes shot outward and upward, glancing, glittering. Opal, rainbow lights lit the sky where clouds were softly piled, rose and amber and purple. The prairie was a vast expanse of soft grey, with golden light suffused over it, the sand giving back the glory of the heavens. Transfixed, she watched the sun rise across the mound and thought of the man who lay at her feet. Soon the intense cold recalled her to herself and drove her into the house. She must get in and keep the fire going, because Lige would be so cold when he came in, almost frozen from his long ride. He would come as fast as he could, once he was sober and able to think again. He'd probably borrow a fresh horse from one of the boys, because his was almost foundered. She could vision him riding across the prairie, outlined against the morning sky, spurring his horse so that he might get to her quickly, to keep her from being scared. To keep her from being scared. How could she meet him when he came? He would put his arms around her and tell her he knew how the wind had deviled her out of her senses, and he didn't hold it against her. He would call her pobrecita. But no, that word was soiled now because the other man had used it. Was there anything in her life that could ever be clean again, or had word Roddy soiled everything? She made up the fire again and warmed her half-frozen body before it. She must start breakfast before Lige came, because he'd be hungry as well as cold. And anyway, when your hands were busy, you didn't have to think. You could forget for a moment, maybe. Could she ever forget till the grave closed her in? Even when she was buried deep in her grave, would she see dead eyes staring at her from half-shut lids? Hear the wind wail to her like a demon lover? She glanced out of the window at the long mound of sand by the windbreak. It was just as she had left it. She would sit by the fire a little while before she began her morning's work. Strange how tired it made you not to sleep for 2 nights. It made your head ring queerly, too, as if the wind were blowing inside it. It made it fidgety, as if sand was seeping into your brain. But the wind was quiet now. What was it they said out here in Texas? Never mind the weather so the wind don't blow. The wind had never been so still before. Had it blown so hard during the night that it had blown itself all off the earth for good and all, lost itself somewhere between the other worlds? Were there other women there for it to torture and drive mad? It wouldn't be happy if there weren't. But if it had gone away for good, she could be herself again. But no, the windows rattled ever so slightly, as if by some faint gust. It was like the wind to fool her. It was chuckling to itself now, somewhere in hiding, to think how it had fooled her. Well, after all, it was more natural to hear a little wind blowing. Nothing to be scared about in the least. She glanced out of the window to see if she could tell whether the wind was from the north or not. Surely there wouldn't be another norther again so soon. No, it wasn't a norther coming again, for the wind was blowing more from the east. She could tell by the little puffs of sand that were drifting toward the west. She gave a sigh of immense relief. No norther again now. Then she started apprehensively. A light veil of sand was lifting from above the mound against the windbreak. But it was only a little wind, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Nothing at all. Besides, hadn't the wind done its worst to her already? Could anything but the wind have made her commit murder? There, word Roddy was lying under that mound of sand, a mound not quite so high and rounded as it had been a little while before, because he had put the fear of the wind in her soul that day long ago on the train. The wind had been listening and had punished him for his blasphemy. Those scornful lips, those mocking eyes, would never jeer at her again, at her or at the wind. If those eyelids lifted there in the darkness, the shroud of sand would cover them. The wind was growing higher now and rattled the windows louder. She shivered as she listened. The wind made her remember everything. Her mind went on searching out the line by which events happened. It was all so clear now. It was the work of the diabolic wind. She was lost and undone because the wind had driven word Roddy to the house last night. He had come because he had known Lige wasn't there. Lige wasn't there because he had been in a rage with her that made him get drunk, so he couldn't be with her when she needed him. She had tormented him with her appeals because the wind had driven her crazy. But she wouldn't have been so easily upset all along If it hadn't been that Wirt Roddy had put the fear of the wind on her like a curse before ever she met Lige or came to the ranch. It was all so plain. She looked out of the window and stared with fright at the mound. Surely she wasn't seeing right. That spot there, that white spot, couldn't be Wirt Roddy's crossed hands showing. Another puff of wind lifted another veil of sand, as if to convince her. Yes, yes. What could she do? Should she go out and cover the dead hands up again? But no, for then the wind would get at her again. Perhaps it hadn't done its worst to her after all. Maybe it was tempting her to come out so that it might have her in its power. But she wouldn't go. If she waited, another gust of wind would blow the sand back over the hands and cover the mounded form more securely. Those hands couldn't move anyhow. They were dead, just as she had left them. They couldn't hurt her, but the wind was different. Nobody could kill the wind. She stood by the window, her face pressed against the pane, her hands clenched, her eyes fixed on that mound. Slowly, grain by grain, the sand was shifting from the treacherous mound. The wind had come from the east, so that the windbreak couldn't shelter the sand any more. Soon the face was uncovered, the face so quiet and stern. She gazed at it, stiff with horror. The eyelids were weighed down with sand, the sand was in the black moustache, but the face showed plainly, the dead face. She started. She must run out and cover up that face again from the gaze of the sun, from her own sight. But no! The wind's gaze was more to be feared than a dead man's face. This was but the trick of the wind to get her out from her shelter, so that it might wreak its wrath on her, might have her utterly at its mercy. When the wind saw that it was useless to try her, that she would not come out, it would grow tired and go away, and the sand would creep back over the dead face. The wind saw her there at the window, watching, and that reminded it of her. She would move away, and then it would forget her. That was the thing to do. The wind was angry that she had read its thoughts so clearly, for it had risen to a gale now and shouted round the house. It called to her to come out if she dared. It defied her, challenged her, mocked her. But she smiled because she was sitting in a corner with her face turned away from the window. She wouldn't let the crafty wind see her at all, and it would think she had gone away, that the house was empty. It would think that she had gone with Lige, or even that she had left for Fort Worth with Wirt Roddy. She would be very quiet, and wouldn't talk back to it at all. She wouldn't even think, for the wind knew what your thoughts were. So she rinsed her mind of all thoughts, all emotions, and made it blank and empty as the desert plain. The wind roared at her, but she didn't answer. She sat there in her corner and smiled craftily to think how she was fooling the wind that thought itself so wise. Still, she couldn't keep her mind entirely blank. A little thought worried her like a heel fly. Why didn't Lige come home? When would he be coming home? After a while she had to listen to the clamour of the wind because it was so loud. She thought of Lige as he might be riding home. It would torment Lige as it had her, since it couldn't get at her any more. It would batter him, try to turn him back, to keep him from coming to her. But Lige would do his best to come to her. Dear Lige. The thought of him steadied her for a moment, made her forget the ringing in her ears, the shouting in her brain. Perhaps he was coming now. Maybe if she looked out she could see him riding to her across the prairies. She rose and crept stealthily to the window to look out toward the west. But he was not in sight. But perhaps, by some queer chance, he was coming from the other way. So she turned to the window facing east. No, he wasn't there, anywhere on the plains. The wind had taken him. So it hadn't done its worst to her after all, a while ago, when she thought it had. Should she look once at the mound to see that the sand had shifted back safely over it? Just once would she look, to satisfy herself that it was all covered again. She would peer so quickly that the wind couldn't see her. She looked, then gave a wild scream. There was no mound at all by the windbreak, only bare ground, and the dead body of a man lying there, with his hands folded across his breast. A buzzard floated above it. So the wind was determined Lige should know. The wind was even now whispering the truth in his ears, shouting it at him. Why struggle against a force that was a devil and all-powerful? She had known all along that the wind would get her. Hadn't she even told Roddy that? No use to fight any more. She would give up. The wind had risen almost to cyclonic fury now. Again the curtains of sand were rolling up from the plains to the sky, wavering, shifting, their gigantic folds writhing with hideous suggestion. What horrors did those curtains hide? With a laugh that strangled on a scream, the woman sped to the door, flung it open, and rushed out. She fled across the prairies like a leaf blown in a gale, borne along in the force of the wind that was at last to have its way with her. End of chapter 15. End of The Wind by Dorothy Scarborough. Thanks for listening.